Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? Story 1. My father was married to another woman before meeting my mother. They had a daughter, and my dad loved her so much that his wife became uncontrollably jealous. My dad started noticing strange behavior from her towards their daughter, and when he tried to confront her about it, she began arguing with him. Fearing for his daughter's safety, he left with her and went to my uncle's house. The woman, however, knew that my dad would leave the girl with my aunt while he was at work. She called the police, claiming that my aunt had kidnapped her child. The police arrived and took the girl away from my aunt. My aunt immediately tried to contact my dad, but by then, the woman had already gone back home, poisoned her daughter's milk, and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter already dead and the woman gone. She was never found, and my dad never got justice for his first child. It's heartbreaking. Later, when I was born, my mother didn't mind naming me after my sister. That's actually how I found out about the tragedy. I asked my parents about the origin of my name, and they told me the whole story. Story 2. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends were all called up in the draft. None of them wanted to go, of course, but they didn't come from wealthy families and had jobs that supported their households. If they were arrested for avoiding the draft, their families would lose the income they depended on. So they came up with a plan. They decided that on their way to get their medical checks, they would crash their car into a tree. The goal was to sustain injuries severe enough to be disqualified from military service, but not so severe as to cause permanent damage. It also had to look like an accident to avoid legal trouble. Since they lived in rural Western Australia, their excuse would be that they swerved to avoid a kangaroo. My grandfather was driving, one friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His youngest brother sat directly behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree at around 40 kph, fast enough to cause serious injuries. My grandfather broke his leg, the man behind him broke his arm, and everyone suffered broken ribs. They were definitely not fit for war after that. The plan fell apart, though, because they weren't wearing seatbelts, common for rural Australia in the 60s, and they didn't consider internal injuries. Nobody found them or the car for over an hour. By then, my grandfather's brother had bled to death in the back seat from a ruptured spleen. He was dead before they reached the hospital. My grandfather carried the guilt for the rest of his life and never spoke of it. As far as we know, he only told my grandmother, who eventually told my mother and me long after his death. While cleaning out their house after my grandmother passed last year, we found a small box with a newspaper clipping from the time of the accident. It said they had swerved to avoid a kangaroo and called it a tragic accident. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so this is technically still a family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. Story 3. My father met my mother in the Philippines when he was stationed there in the Navy. They got married, and I was conceived shortly after. However, he had to leave to finish his tour of duty. My mother moved to America a month before giving birth to me. She stayed with relatives in Texas, trying to adjust to a new country and culture while preparing to become a mother. Meanwhile, my father's tour ended in Hawaii, where he met another woman. He called my mother and asked for a divorce, wanting to end their marriage, even with a baby on the way, because of a fling he had with this woman. My mother, already feeling scared and alone in a foreign country and unable to speak much English, was devastated. She was heavily pregnant, about to give birth, and her husband was abandoning her for someone he barely knew. When my uncle in Texas heard about this, he flew to Hawaii, ready to confront my father. Somehow, he convinced him to take responsibility for his wife and child. Of course, it probably helped that the woman he had the fling with dumped him. My father returned to Texas just in time for my birth. I learned about all this when I was 11, around the time my parents got divorced. It was the first of many dark family secrets I would uncover during my teenage years. Story 4. My grandfather was an alcoholic and an awful person. He was a terrible father and husband who made life miserable for my mom, my 2 uncles, and my grandmother. He would beat them, terrify them whenever he came home drunk, and leave them hiding under their beds for hours until he finally passed out. When my grandmother was 40, she was diagnosed with cancer and almost died. My mom, who was just 17 at the time, had to take care of her on her own while juggling her apprenticeship. She would visit my grandmother in the hospital, an hour away, every day. All she ever heard from her father during that time was that he hoped the B** teach would just finally die. My mom managed to hold everything together despite all this, but life was hard. To make things worse, my grandfather was somewhat well known in the city for his job, though I'm not sure exactly what he did. People would always recognize our family name and talk about how wonderful my grandfather was. They'd say how lucky I must be to have such a great grandfather. They knew nothing about who he truly was. Story 5. My grandfather was an incredible man and a WW2 sniper paratrooper. He never liked to talk about his time in the military, and it wasn't until much later that I learned why. He was dishonorably discharged after an injury, but there was much more to the story. During a mission, his squad sergeant ordered him to jump from a plane flying too low for a safe landing. My grandfather protested, calling the jump dangerous, but the sergeant insulted him and shoved him out of the plane. Both my grandfather and his spotter were seriously injured during the landing. His spotter was paralyzed and lost a leg, while my grandfather broke both legs, his arm, his hand, and several ribs. They were rescued and taken to a military hospital. While recovering, the sergeant came to visit, and my grandfather, furious and in pain, punched him square in the face with his one good hand, twice. According to his only surviving squad mate, he knocked the man out cold. Because of this and his injuries, my grandfather was discharged and sent home for the rest of the war. Years later, after my grandfather passed away, we found a box of newspaper clippings and letters among his things. The clippings detailed how the same sergeant caused the deaths of 2 other squad members in a similar incident a year later. He was eventually discharged himself and reportedly drank himself to death. We also found unsent letters my grandfather had written to the sergeant, as well as photos of his old squad, including the 2 men who died. It was heartbreaking to see the pain he had carried with him. My grandfather had always been such a kind, fun-loving man, and I never imagined he had gone through something so dark. Now I understand why my parents told us never to bring up the army around him. Miss you, Grandpa? I'd have punched that bastard too. Story 6. When I was younger, I thought it was nice that my Nana lived with my aunt and her family. With 6 kids in the house, there were always people around to look after her. My aunt occasionally complained about being the one stuck with the responsibility, but as a child, I didn't think much of it. Years later, I found out the real story. My aunt and her husband convinced my Nana to put her house in their name so they could manage her affairs. Then, they sold the house and invested all the money into a pyramid scheme, losing everything. Because of this betrayal, none of my aunt's siblings give her a penny to help with Nana's living expenses. Instead, they pitch in to take Nana out for meals, shopping, and activities, ensuring she doesn't go without while letting my aunt bear the financial burden of her day-to-day care. Since my aunt's kids are grown and independent now, they're not affected by her money problems. Looking back, my aunt's complaints about being stuck with Nana seem hollow and infuriating. She created this situation with her greed and deceit. Story 7. My grandmother entered an abusive relationship at the age of 17. Her boyfriend was an alcoholic who forced himself on her while drunk, and when she became pregnant, they were forced to marry because that's how things were in the 1950s. Over the years, they had 5 children together, though one didn't survive childbirth. Her husband remained an abusive alcoholic, and my grandmother feared for her life. Eventually, she fled from him and her family to survive. She met my grandfather during this time, and they fell in love. He sold the only thing he owned, a small moped, to help her escape. Since custody of her children had been given to her mother, a common practice at the time, she left them with her family and built a new life with my grandfather. They eventually married, had 3 more kids, and reconnected with her first 4 daughters later in life. For years, everything seemed to be going well, but there was a rumor in their small town about my grandmother's past. It claimed that one of her daughters from her first marriage wasn't actually her husband's child, but was fathered by someone else. The daughters didn't know about this until they heard the gossip. They confronted my grandmother, who denied it completely. Unsatisfied, they took a DNA test, and the results proved the rumor was true. One of the daughters was indeed a half-sister to the others. When they brought the proof to my grandmother, she continued to deny it, insisting all 4 daughters had the same father. Hurt and angry, the daughters went no contact with her, saying they could never forgive her for abandoning them and then lying about something so significant. To this day, my grandmother maintains her denial, despite the DNA evidence. Story 8. My step-grandfather was an alcoholic for most of his life. As a kid, I didn't see the bad sides of his drinking. He even taught me how to mix his favorite drink when I was about 6 years old. I would mix it for him and bring it to him in the living room. He always acted funny after drinking, and I found it amusing, so I loved spending time with him. He never made me drink or did anything that negatively affected me directly, so to me, he was just a funny grandpa who made me cocoa and watched Garfield with me. But before I was born, his alcoholism had a much darker side. He would get so drunk that he threatened to kill my grandma. After a car accident, he came home bleeding badly from his head and started accusing my grandma of shooting him. He even threw out some of my parents' wedding photos. I had no idea how horrible he was back then because he never showed that side to me. Maybe he had a soft spot for kids. In his later years, before he died, he deeply regretted his drinking and eventually stopped altogether. He became very depressed until his only biological granddaughter was born. Her arrival brought him so much happiness, and he found a new purpose in being part of her life. When he passed away, he was a sober man who was happy to have met his granddaughter, but he died carrying the weight of his past. Despite everything, he changed in the end, and everyone was heartbroken when he died. Story 9. I grew up thinking my favorite cousin had simply disappeared from our lives. He was 13 years older than me and lived with us when I was a baby. After he moved out, he would visit every 6 months or so, but we never visited him or called him. I absolutely adored him and looked forward to his visits, which were some of my favorite moments growing up. By the time I was a teenager, I knew he had issues with his parents. They had kicked him out when he was 13, and my parents took him in. He had a tough time as an adult. He avoided most of the family, moved around a lot, and had trouble holding down jobs. My parents often didn't know where he was, so his visits were sporadic and unpredictable. But then in my late teens, the visits stopped completely. I kept asking if anyone had heard from him, and I was told no. I asked for a way to contact him, but they always said they didn't have a number or address. Years passed, and I started to worry that he might be dead. I missed him so much. In my late 20s, I finally found out the truth. He wasn't missing. He was in prison for murder. From what I heard, it was somewhat justified. He was defending his new wife, someone I never got the chance to meet. What hurt even more was learning that the extended family had sided with his abusive parents and refused to support him or his wife after his arrest. They even pressured my dad into not helping him, despite how close they had been. I tried to send him a message in prison, but I don't know if he ever received it. I wish he knew that I didn't abandon him like the rest of the family. I just didn't know the truth for all those years. Story 10. As a teenager, I only heard that my cousin Terry's engagement ended shortly before the wedding. Nobody in the family seemed to want to say more about it. Years later, I learned the full story. Terry and his fiancée Joan got engaged after she became pregnant. Things seemed fine at first, but 2 weeks before the wedding, Terry's mom, Isis, became gravely ill and almost died. Terry asked Joan if they could postpone the wedding until Isis recovered so she could attend. Joan didn't just refuse, she called off the wedding entirely over the phone. When Terry went home to talk to her, he found the house completely emptied. Only his belongings remained. Everything else, even the bed, was gone. Terry tried calling Joan, but she didn't answer. He called her family, but their phones were also disconnected. When he went to their house, it was vacant, and even Joan's siblings claimed to have no idea where they had gone. It was as if they'd disappeared. Eventually, Terry discovered that Joan and her family had packed up and moved to the other side of the country. Joan even attempted to leave the country with their child. This entire ordeal dragged on for 3 years. After a long legal battle, Terry was awarded primary custody of his child. Today, he's a single dad who treasures every moment with his kid. I've never asked him what became of Joan, and I don't plan to. Story 11. For most of my life, I thought my mom's parents divorced because they fell out of love. Recently, I found out the truth. My grandfather had an affair with a married woman from their church. The families had been close for years, and my mom was good friends with the other woman's children. Both couples divorced, and less than a year later, my grandfather married his mistress. The fallout was hard on everyone, but the other woman's children suffered the most. Neither she nor her ex-husband were responsible parents, and the oldest daughter ended up taking on a motherly role at just 12 years old. My biological grandmother, bless her, never told anyone about the affair. When I told her I'd found out, she gave me a quiet smile, like she was relieved someone finally knew it wasn't her fault. I can't imagine keeping that secret for so many years, unable to explain to her kids why their lives had been upended. I learned this while helping care for my step-grandmother during her hospice stay last fall. The end-of-life medication made her extra talkative, and she let the truth slip. It was shocking because my grandfather always seemed like a kind, straight-laced churchgoer, the last person you'd suspect of cheating. In my shock, I told my mom what I'd learned, and it was clear she had no idea. I regret saying anything to her. I wish I could take it back. Story 12. My uncle committed suicide when I was about 10 years old. I remember him showing up at our house one day with a beat-up old car he'd bought for next to nothing. The very next day, He drove it into the woods, ran a hose from the exhaust pipe into the car, and ended his life. He was one of 5 brothers and had a daughter, who I'm still in contact with today. It wasn't until much later that I learned the secret behind his death. My mother let it slip after 30 years. Turns out, my uncle had been involved in a car accident where a girl in the car was decapitated. Someone lost control of the car, and it went under a large lorry. 2 of his brothers were also in the car, and it had been after a night out. So drinking was almost certainly involved. To this day, nobody in the family knows, or is willing to say, who was actually driving. My uncle was a sensitive soul who couldn't bear the guilt of what happened. He was turned away at the girl's funeral, and it weighed on him heavily. Our family has carried a shadow over it ever since. I feel like I missed out on a lot of normal family experiences because of this tragedy. His twin brother, who was also in the car, became a lifelong alcoholic and is the only brother still alive today. My dad never got along with him, and there was always tension when they were in the same room. I suspect there's some deep resentment or unspoken truth between them about that night. I'd love to hear my uncle's side of the story, but he's not someone you approach casually, and I doubt I'll ever know what really happened. Story 13. I was never directly told, but as I got older, I realized that my dad was bishul. My mom passed away from breast cancer when I was 5, and not long after, a male flight attendant, whom my dad called Uncle Boffle, started visiting our house regularly. They'd have drinks in the living room late into the night before retreating to the bedroom. Sometimes, I'd hear the bed creaking. This was in the late 80s to early 90s, so there wasn't an internet culture to clue me in on what was happening. The visit stopped when I was around 9, and my dad remarried when I was 10. There was one incident when I was about 10 where I snuck into their bedroom and found a collection of magazines, both straight and gay, with explicit stories. I was a voracious reader at the time and read anything I could find. Even though I didn't fully understand the context, I somehow knew I wasn't supposed to be reading them. It wasn't until my 20s that the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My dad, who had always been a bit of a Christian fundamentalist, had said some negative things about LGBTQ plus people in the past. Not outright hateful, but judgmental. Looking back, it's strange to reconcile those moments with what I now understand about his past. Story 14. I found out when I was 15 that the man I had always thought was my father was not my biological dad. This explained a lot about our strained relationship and the way he treated me differently from my siblings. My biological father had abandoned my mother when he found out she was pregnant, leaving her to raise me alone. At 18, I decided to track him down. After years of searching, I discovered where his brother worked and left a message there, explaining who I was and that I wanted to connect. Ironically, the message was handed to him at his other brother's funeral. Eventually, he reached out to me and we met. The meeting seemed to go okay at first, but there were red flags. He only kept my number on his work phone and didn't want to tell his kids about me, claiming they were all in a good place and that his wife wouldn't want me in their lives. I strongly suspect he never even told her about me. For 3 months, we would meet up occasionally for coffee, usually at a McDonald's drive-thru. Then, just as suddenly as he had entered my life, he stopped responding to my messages and ghosted me completely. He walked out on me, not once, but twice in my life. It's laughable to me now because I know I'm a better father to my kids than he could ever dream of being. His absence taught me what kind of man I never want to be. Story 15. My grandfather served in World War II, where he lived an extraordinary life. He was bombed by the Japanese, became a paratrooper, what would later become Special Forces, and even earned the title of Army National Boxing Champion. One story about him stands out above the rest. One day during the war, he and some of his mates were eating lunch in a diner. At a nearby table, another group of soldiers was sitting, and one of them was being loud, obnoxious, and inappropriate, especially toward the waitress. My grandfather politely told the loudmouth to tone it down. The man refused and told my grandfather to mind his own business. Grandpa, being the man he was, stood up and asked him to step outside to settle the matter. The loudmouth took one look at Grandpa, a 5'10", 70 kilograms guy, and thought he had an easy fight on his hands. Loudmouth himself was a big guy, over 6 feet tall and at least 90 kilograms. Confidently, he followed Grandpa outside, boasting about the beating he was about to deliver. Grandpa gave him one last chance. Apologize to the waitress, go back inside and behave. Loudmouth refused and squared up. In one swift move, Grandpa threw a right hook that connected perfectly with Loudmouth's jaw, breaking it with a loud crack. The man fell backward, hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Tragically, the impact killed him, either instantly or shortly afterward. Grandpa was arrested and court-martialed for second-degree murder. Thankfully, it was a different time, and witnesses testified that it had been a fair fight. Grandpa was acquitted and went on to complete heroic and still classified missions during the war. We didn't find out about this story until years later, long after Grandpa had passed away. Even knowing he killed a man with one punch doesn't change how I feel about him. He was a kind, honorable man who stood up for what was right. I miss him every day and wish he were still here. Story 16. My grandmother grew up in a conservative rural village in Belgium. When she was 18, she had a romantic encounter in the bushes during a local fair. A moment of passion that would change her life forever. A few weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. She tried to keep her pregnancy a secret for as long as she could, but once it became obvious, the community turned against her. She was shamed, insulted, and ostracized. People threw things at her house, and her family was relentlessly ridiculed, called sinners for her disgrace. Eventually, she was effectively banished from her hometown for having premarital S. As a single mother, she moved to the other side of the country to start over. There, she met my grandfather, who not only accepted her but also embraced her child as his own. Years later, my father was born. However, it wasn't until after my grandfather passed away that my father learned that his older brother was actually his half-brother. The topic was never openly discussed in the family. My dad always tells me how much of a badass his mother was. At a time when it was highly unconventional for a woman to work, she built a career for herself in an office. She was fiercely independent and never let societal expectations hold her back. After my grandfather passed away, my grandmother returned to her childhood village, which always felt like a triumphant revenge to me. In her old age, she remarried to a man she'd been in love with when she was just 16. She looked absolutely fabulous on her wedding day and radiated pride and confidence. She was the proudest and most resilient woman I've ever known, a feminist without trying to be one. She simply lived her life unapologetically and didn't care what anyone thought. May she rest in peace. Story 17. My family history is a whirlwind of drama and secrets. One of my great-grandfathers was a fascist who was sentenced to death after the war. His sentence was later reduced to life in prison and eventually shortened even further, though the fairness of this decision is still debated within the family. My other great-grandfather was murdered in front of his son, my grandfather. A man shot him, and my grandfather barely escaped with his life, getting shot in the arm as he fled. My great-grandmother knew who was behind the murder but refused to tell her sons. She feared they would seek revenge and didn't reveal the truth until she was on her deathbed. Another great-grandmother supposedly read tarot cards for a prominent political figure during a crucial decision-making period. While my family loves to hype up her involvement, I suspect her role in history might be exaggerated. My grandmother's brother led a tragic life. He was adored by a famous female poet, but he was gay and ultimately murdered by his lover. This was kept secret from the family for years because his mother was very religious. My grandmother, who loved her brother deeply, never fully recovered from his death. On a lighter note, my grandfather had a flair for acting and was allegedly offered projects in Hollywood. However, he declined because he found the people there too gay for his liking. His brother, on the other hand, took on minor roles in small films. He carried a gun everywhere and acted like a celebrity, though his career was far from glamorous. It all sounds almost too wild to be true, but those were fascinating and chaotic times to be alive. Story 18. My grandfather and his first girlfriend were deeply in love. They started dating in their teens, around 16, and were inseparable. By the time they were in their 20s, everyone believed they were meant for each other. Then one day, my grandfather heard a rumor that his girlfriend had entertained some unknown men at her apartment. This was the 1950s, so such gossip carried a lot of weight. They argued, the trust broke, and they split up. Almost immediately, my grandmother swooped in and married him. They went on to have 3 children, including my mom, but my grandfather never stopped loving his ex-girlfriend. She also moved on, got married, and had children. However, the love they shared didn't fade. The moment my mom, the youngest child, moved out, my grandparents divorced. My grandfather reunited with his first love, and they lived together until her death a few years ago. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. My maternal grandmother was an alcoholic, and while drunk, she once confessed that she had started the rumor about the unknown men. She admitted to tearing my grandfather and his girlfriend apart because she wanted him for herself. My mom told me this recently, adding that because my grandmother was drunk when she said it, we can't confirm if it's true. Still, it left me reeling. If what she said was true, I only exist because of my grandmother's jealousy and the heartbreak she caused. I've struggled to reconcile this revelation. I loved my grandmother deeply, but knowing she may have sabotaged such a beautiful relationship makes me feel conflicted. Story 19. My father was a dentist, as was his stepfather. They shared an office until my grandfather passed away when I was 5. My dad worked in the front office while the back office remained untouched. I assumed it was left that way out of respect for my step-grandmother, who lived upstairs. Years later, while comparing some old dental instruments with my younger brother, I came across a giant curved forceps and asked what it was for. That's when my brother casually dropped the bomb. "Oh, didn't you know he used to do abortions in the rear office?" I had no idea. But suddenly, so many things made sense. The late nights at the office, the cash payments, and even bartered items that patients would use to pay him. I was too young and naive when I left for college to be let in on this secret, but my younger brother, who stayed home longer, knew all about it. At first, I was shocked, but that feeling quickly gave way to pride. Illegal abortions are a tragic necessity, often sought by those with the least resources and the most desperate need. My father, who had a reputation for kindness and generosity, provided a critical service to hundreds of women who might otherwise have faced unspeakable consequences. He was an excellent dentist, but an unhappy one. He had the hands of a surgeon, but lived in an era when being a black man meant his career options were limited. Knowing that he used his skills to help so many people, even at great personal risk, makes me incredibly proud. Story 20. When I was a kid, my dad used to take frequent trips to Europe, often 3 or 4 times a year. He'd be gone for weeks, sometimes a month. And whenever I asked where he went or why, the answers were always vague. These trips stopped entirely when I was around 14, and I didn't think much about it. Fast forward to when I was 18. My dad took me on a 2-hour drive to a nearby town. It was a scenic route, but I could tell he had something important to tell me. He explained that our family was part of a larger, historic family in Italy, going back 7, 10 generations. The core family had 8 daughters who married and started their own branches. Apparently, their father left a massive inheritance, but it was stipulated to go to the surviving family. For centuries, these branches had been locked in a deadly competition, trying to kill each other off while also outbreeding one another. He told me wild stories about cousins being smuggled on ships to escape assassination attempts, only to return decades later to avenge their families. It sounded like something out of a movie. Shortly after I was born, my dad learned that a distant cousin from another branch was actively plotting to kill our family. This man had already driven my dad's brother into hiding in Venezuela and his sister into Argentina. They funded my dad's trips to Europe so he could track this man down and deal with the threat. My dad revealed scars he hadn't had when I was younger, remnants of fights with this cousin who had tried to kill him multiple times. Finally, in 1998, my dad caught him in Sardinia, strangled him to death, and buried him under gravel at an abandoned mine. He described the event in chilling detail, and I believed him. He admitted this wasn't the first relative he had killed. He told me all of this so that if he died suddenly or if threats were made against me or my family, I would know why. That evening, I skipped going spotting for deer with him because I had a class I didn't want to miss. Later, during the class, police showed up to inform me that my dad had been found dead on a mountain trail. They said it was likely a massive heart attack, which made sense given his poor health, but the timing and circumstances were suspicious. His body was found just hours later, near a major trail, with his truck and cell phone nearby. I pushed my mom for an autopsy, but she refused, too devastated to consider it. She insisted on cremation. Nothing strange has happened since, but I'll always wonder if his death was really natural or if someone finally caught up to him. Story 21. When I was about 10, I was snooping around in my older sister's room and found some old photos of my mom and sister with a man I assumed was my dad. I thought to myself, wow, Dad looked really different when he was younger. Later, I casually mentioned this to my mom, saying, Dad looked so different in those old pictures. My mom asked what I meant, and I admitted I'd been snooping in my sister's room and found the photos. I didn't think much of it, but soon after I was called into a family meeting. During this meeting, my parents told me that the man in the photo wasn't my dad. My mom explained that she had been married before and that the man in the pictures was her first husband. She also told me that my sister wasn't my dad's biological daughter. She was my half-sister. If that wasn't enough to process, they dropped another bombshell. I also had a half-brother I'd never met. My mom explained that her first husband had taken my half-brother with him when they separated. leaving her to raise my sister alone. I was confused and overwhelmed, as you'd expect. My parents stressed that I shouldn't treat my sister any differently, and after that meeting, the topic was never discussed again. I finally met my half-brother when I was 16, but by then, resentment had built up toward my mom for keeping such a massive secret. It felt like my entire perception of my family had been shattered. The moral of the story? Be careful snooping. It might uncover things your family would rather keep hidden. Story 22. My cousin was always held up as the golden boy of the family. Growing up, we were constantly compared to him by my grandmother. If our grades weren't up to her standards, or if we misbehaved, she would scold us harshly and remind us to be more like him, studying hard and building a successful life in England. We all believed he had gone to the University of Oxford and worked for a Fortune 500 company in England. None of us questioned it, and my grandmother made sure to maintain the illusion. Everything came crashing down at my grandmother's funeral. My cousin threw a massive tantrum when he found out she had donated all her assets to charity. Right there, in front of her coffin, my uncle slapped him hard across the face and revealed the truth. It turns out my cousin was a high school dropout who had been leeching off my grandmother, girlfriends, and parents for years. My grandmother had rented a condo for him and given him thousands of dollars a month to keep him hidden from the rest of us. He wasn't in England at all. He was living nearby, doing nothing for almost 15 years. The kicker? My grandmother knew he was a fraud, but played along because he was her first grandchild and grandson. She felt compelled to protect him, even if it meant lying to the rest of the family. Hearing this at her funeral was jarring. I couldn't bring myself to shed a tear for her. She had spent years making us feel inadequate compared to a man who had done absolutely nothing with his life. Story 23. Growing up, my grandfather was my father figure. He was a tough, Depression-era man who taught me everything about hunting, fishing, and survival. We watched Clint Eastwood movies together, and for a long time I thought he was Clint's character Philo Beddoe from Every Which Way But Loose. I later found out my granddad had a darker side. He was a felon and had done time for severely injuring a man with a crowbar during a drunken party. Every hunting trip we took together was technically illegal since he wasn't allowed to own firearms. Granddad had a group of friends he did redditrelationship with, hunting, fishing, and partying. The last of his close friends, a man we'll call Texas, became a mentor to me after my grandfather passed away in my teens. Texas was the quintessential redneck. Big hat, no shirt, Bowie knife always on his hip. He was also surprisingly smart, a great cook, and threw the best 4th of July parties, complete with BBQ, catfish, and fireworks. One night before what would be one of our last hunting trips together, Texas shared something I've never forgotten. My mom had just dropped me off at his place, and we were sitting around drinking beers. He was reminiscing about my granddad, telling stories of their exploits. Texas let this slip. There's a lot of bad in this world. Your granddaddy and I both knew that. Sometimes when we ran into bad folks, we made them disappear. You'd be surprised how much people taste like BBQ when done right. I laughed it off, thinking it was a drunk joke. But years later, after Texas passed away from a heart attack, human remains were discovered in his backyard. The same backyard where we had all those 4th of July cookouts and BBQs. I'll never know for sure, but the thought that those stories about making bad folks disappear weren't just jokes has haunted me ever since. Story 24. I found out that my uncle, who I had always admired as a charming and charismatic man, was actually a wanted con artist. Growing up, he seemed larger than life. He dressed sharply, told fascinating stories, and would gift me coins or money from other countries at family gatherings. But I noticed that my mom and her siblings always seemed uneasy around him. As a kid, I assumed they were just jealous of his success, since we lived in small-town Midwest, and he had made it big in Chicago. Things began to shift when I was a teenager. After a divorce, he started appearing less frequently at family events. When he did show up, he always had a new girlfriend. At the time, it seemed normal. The truth came out the summer after my freshman year of college. I was at my parents' house when an angry man called, demanding to know where my uncle was. He was furious and accused me of lying to protect him, but I genuinely had no idea where my uncle was. The call shook me, so I asked my parents about it later that night. That's when they told me the truth. My uncle was a con artist. He would pose as a wealthy businessman, dating women and earning their trust, only to steal their money once he had enough personal information. Then he'd disappear without a trace. The uneasiness I'd noticed in my family was because he'd conned them too. Over the years, he'd convinced my aunts, uncles, and even my grandmother to bail him out financially. each believing they were helping him through a tough time. These bailouts totaled around $10,000 each, but my grandmother suffered the most. In her later years, after being diagnosed with dementia, my uncle depleted her savings entirely. My parents had to step in to support her elder care. None of my family members knew the full extent of his lies until strangers started calling, demanding money or information about him. That's when they finally put the pieces together. Looking back, I feel betrayed, not just by him, but by the image he projected. The cool uncle was nothing but a fraud. Story 25. My dad murdered his best friend's child molester. Back in northern Pennsylvania, my dad was dating a girl from a large family. Her youngest brother, who I'll call Sam, became good friends with my dad. Even after my dad and Sam's sister broke up, he and Sam stayed close. One day, a well-respected man in their small town abducted Sam and another boy. He had removed the locks and door handles from the inside of his car to trap them. The man got the boys drunk, and then the unthinkable happened. Sam confided in my dad about what had happened. My dad, furious, went to the police, but they didn't believe him. The abuser's spotless reputation shielded him, and no one in the community was willing to help. Months passed, and my dad decided to take matters into his own hands. He started asking around about the man's hunting habits, knowing this wouldn't raise suspicion in their hunting-obsessed town. Eventually, he learned the man's favorite hunting spot. One snowy Pennsylvania morning, the respected man died in a hunting accident. A stray bullet ended his life, and the snow erased any trace of my dad's involvement. Years later, when I was in my early 20s, my dad told me the story. Stunned, I went to my mom and brother, and they both said, "He finally told you, didn't he?" I don't condone murder, but in this case, I understand why my dad did what he did. In a world where justice failed Sam, my dad made sure his abuser never hurt another child. Story 26. My grandfather has two families. In the mid-1970s, my grandfather, then 44, was a ceramics professor and head of the art department at a private university in my hometown. He was married to my grandmother, and they had 5 children aged 6 to 17. In 1976, my grandfather confessed to my grandmother that he had been having an affair with one of his students, who was 22 years younger than him, and that she was pregnant. He divorced my grandmother, married the student, and had 3 daughters with her. They are still married to this day. This means my mother has 3 half-sisters, whom I consider my aunts. The youngest of them is only a year older than I am, I'm 30, and my grandfather is now 88. After the divorce, my grandmother raised all 5 kids on her own while living in poverty and battling multiple sclerosis. Despite everything, she remained close friends with my grandfather until she passed away in 2008. Before her death, we always celebrated Thanksgiving and Christmas together as one big dysfunctional family. Looking back, it's crazy to realize that she was the one holding us all together, even after everything she endured. Story 27. My family's story during the Vietnam War is a complicated one. My grandmother always said she found my mom on the streets and took her in as an adopted child. However, my mom's childhood was horrific. She was mistreated, forced to do the dishes, laundry, and cooking for everyone. She was beaten for the smallest mistakes, or for no reason at all. Being not blood meant she didn't belong. She was treated like the family servant. When the Amerasian program allowed children born to U.S. fathers to immigrate to the United States, my mom applied and was approved. She definitely didn't look fully Vietnamese. She came to the States while pregnant with me, but my father was left behind. Growing up, I was told he wasn't allowed to come. The truth was much darker. My mother had to choose between bringing my father or my grandmother along through the program. Fearing she wouldn't be allowed entry if she was married, she told the consulate that I had no father and chose her mother instead. Years later, when my grandmother passed away on Christmas, she made a deathbed confession. She revealed that my mom wasn't adopted at all. She was her biological daughter. My grandmother admitted she had disappeared for nearly a year because her cousin had set her up to be raped by an American soldier. Too ashamed to tell her husband the truth, she fabricated the story about finding my mom on the streets. Curious about my heritage, I did a 23andMe DNA test. I'd always felt like something was off between me and my mom. I'm almost 6 feet tall, which is unusual for someone of Vietnamese descent. The test revealed that I'm 73% Vietnamese, with the rest mixed Scandinavian, British, Irish, and other European ancestry. No close relatives have matched with me on 23andMe yet, just distant cousins. My mom has no interest in digging further into the past, knowing how tragic and painful it would be to uncover more. Her biological father isn't someone she wants to find, and chances are slim that he's still alive anyway. On the bright side, one thing I got from my mixed heritage is a ridiculous tolerance for alcohol. No one in my family can outdrink me, though honestly, that might not be something to brag about. I may be an alcoholic. Story 28. My mom is married to a meth addict. When I was a kid, there were periods of chaos in our home that I didn't understand at the time. Furniture was smashed or thrown around, the shouting was loud and terrifying, and the words exchanged were deeply degrading. I grew up thinking these fights were about money. Last year, I confided in my mom about my own trauma. An ex-lover had raped me. Sharing this truth with her emboldened her to finally share her own. Those violent times in my childhood, they weren't about money. My mom told me it was because of a leaked video circulating at her office. The woman in the video resembled my mom, and word of it got back to her husband. Instead of standing by her or even verifying whether it was true, he believed the rumors and made it his mission to humiliate and degrade her. My mom had no one in her corner during this time. She knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't her in the video, but she bore the weight of the accusations entirely alone. She didn't tell her parents, thinking they wouldn't understand. She didn't tell us kids because we were too young. She had no friends she could trust to vent to. She endured the violence from her husband, the judgment of her coworkers, and the scorn of acquaintances, all while carrying this agony by herself. A decade later, she was finally able to release this truth. Knowing what she went through has shifted how I see her in the world. While I wish I could have been there to emotionally support her, I realize I was too young at the time to understand. The truth, as painful as it was to hear, has brought us closer. It's a reminder that the truth, no matter how long it takes, truly can set you free. Story 29. The story of my uncle's death is one of tragedy, but also of a long hidden truth. What I'd always been told was that my uncle died in a motorcycle accident caused by his friend. The story went that his friend swerved in front of him, causing my uncle to crash and break his neck. I was told he died screaming, and this hit my dad, who was 14 or 15 at the time, very hard. That morning, they'd had a typical brothers argument. My dad said things he didn't mean, and in his mind, his brother was murdered shortly after. My grandparents completely shut down emotionally, forbidding anyone from talking about my uncle. This left my dad with no way to process his grief. Now, in his 60s, my dad still has breakdowns because he never learned how to cope with the loss. Last year, my grandmother finally spoke about what really happened. The truth was very different. My uncle and his friend had been racing their motorcycles. A steep bend was coming up, and while his friend slowed down, my uncle didn't. He lost control, came off his bike at high speed, and broke his neck. He didn't die instantly. He held on for a bit and was able to speak to the officer who arrived before he passed. He even left a message for my grandparents and my dad. My grandmother, however, never passed on that message. She allowed my dad to believe his brother had died because of someone else's actions. She let him carry 45 years of anger, guilt, and abandonment. When asked why, she simply said, "I lost my son." Yes, she lost her son, but in doing so, she destroyed another. My dad needed her, but she let him drown in grief and misplaced anger instead. Story 30. In the late 1970s, my dad and his family fled their ranch in Guatemala and came to the U.S. after their lives were upended by violence. The ranch, located in the Izabal region, was attacked and destroyed by bandits, with the involvement of a gringo who was looking for Maya guerrilla forces. It was later revealed that the CIA was heavily involved in the region's destabilization. After walking for 2 days to the capital, my dad and 2 of his brothers learned that their father had been killed. Leaving their sisters behind with a half-brother, they made the difficult decision to head to the U.S. They first arrived in San Diego, but eventually moved east to New York. For decades, they sent money back to Guatemala to support their sisters, believing the half-brother was taking care of them. Years later, my dad learned about the CIA's role in Guatemala from a 60 Minutes documentary. This prompted him to try and reconnect with his family back home. After weeks of searching, he contacted one of his nieces through Facebook and discovered a horrifying truth. The half-brother, who was supposed to care for their sisters, had thrown them out after 5 years but continued to collect the money my dad and uncle sent. In the early 2000s, when the new government offered to return a large portion of their stolen land, the half-brother cut a deal for a payout instead and secured a cushy government job. The consequences of his betrayal were devastating. After being thrown out, 4 of the sisters died over the next 12 years. One was murdered, one was kidnapped and presumed dead, one died from domestic abuse, and one was decapitated by an officer. Only one of my dad's sisters survived, and she came to the U.S. just 2 years ago. It's a tragic story of betrayal, survival, and the heavy toll of political interference and familial greed. Story 31. I grew up believing that my mom and her boyfriend had beaten me and my oldest sister so badly that we ended up in a care home at a very young age. Later, my dad took custody of us, but he was also violent. My mom was sent to a mental hospital and remained there until I turned 18. When she was released, I decided to meet her, though I was nervous. During our conversation, she told me that the truth was much darker. According to her, my dad had broken into her house, beaten up her boyfriend, and tried to harm or kill me and my sister with boiling water. At first, I didn't believe her. Years in a mental health facility had taken a toll on her sanity, and conversations with her were difficult. But something about her story stayed with me, so I decided to ask my gran, the one person who had always tried to protect us. To my shock, my gran confirmed that it was true. My dad had attacked everyone in the house, severely injuring us and my mom's boyfriend. He convinced the police that it wasn't him, blaming the boyfriend who had a prior arson charge. Back then in Ireland, the system didn't respect a woman's word or rights. My mom was blamed for everything and imprisoned in a mental health facility for a crime she didn't commit. Meanwhile, my dad lived the rest of his life free of guilt or consequence, taking his lies to the grave. He destroyed my mom's life and mental state to protect himself, leaving her to bear the weight of his violence and lies. Story 32. There's a lot about my grandfather that's shocking, and most of it I learned by eavesdropping on conversations between my mom and my aunts. His first marriage was to an underage girl. He claimed he thought she was 18, but she wasn't. They had 3 children together, but things took a dark turn. One day, she turned on the gas in the oven and tried to kill herself and the kids. My grandfather got home just in time to intervene. After that, he and his in-laws decided the best course of action was to have her parents raise the 2 older children as their own, pretending their mother was their older sister. My grandfather took the baby and soon married my grandmother, who raised the child as her own. Another twist in the story involves my grandmother and her sister, my great-aunt. Both of them were in love with my grandfather, even though my great-aunt was already married. My grandmother ultimately married him and had 4 children with him. From my perspective, I always assumed she was his favorite because of their life together and the kids they had. However, I later learned there was infidelity. He was romantically involved with my great-aunt even before and during my grandmother's battle with breast cancer. That revelation was one of the most shocking and personal for me. And then there's my great-uncle, someone I'd never met, but learned about in a horrifying way. One day at school, I saw a sign and a picture near the middle school principal's office. It was a notice alerting the community that my great-uncle was a registered S offender. The story, as I later heard, was that a neighborhood girl had accused him of taking her into his shower. His grandchildren attended the same school as me, which made the situation even more uncomfortable and surreal. It's hard to reconcile all these dark truths with the family I thought I knew growing up. Every layer of the story seems to bring another revelation. Story 33. This story isn't really dark, just kind of bizarre. When I was in grade school, my parents went on vacation with some friends for a NASCAR race while I stayed with my grandparents. After they got back, I overheard parts of a conversation about my dad being arrested. When I asked why, they told me it was for smashing a bunch of Oreos on a picnic table. At the time, I just thought it was strange. Apparently, smashing cookies in Delaware was illegal. The whole thing was a big deal because my dad had to miss work and make the 8-hour drive back for a court date 2 weeks later. Years later, I learned the full story. My parents and their friends were staying at a state park, which, like most parks, had quiet hours starting at 9 or 10 p.m. Around 11:30 p.m., my dad and his friends were drunk. One of them jumped up on the picnic table, stomping cookies and laughing hysterically. The state park police came over to tell them to quiet down, but another friend had his weed and pipe sitting out on the picnic table. Since the campsite was registered in my dad's name, he got charged for the weed as well as the noise violation. My dad and his friends spent the night locked up until they could see a judge and be released. 2 weeks later, they all drove back for court, where the charges were eventually dropped. It's still one of the weirdest family stories I've ever heard. Story 34. I don't know all the details, but my grandfather murdered someone at a lake in Arizona in the 1950s. He shot a man and was later arrested for it. However, he was released on bail while awaiting trial. Before the trial could happen, 2 men who had been friends of the victim and witnesses to the incident mysteriously turned up dead. With no witnesses left to testify, the charges against my grandfather were dropped. My grandfather went on to live his life, passing away in 2011. He was a tough, no-nonsense man, an Army veteran from Texas who had struggled with alcohol for many years. He quit drinking in the early 1990s, and to me, he always seemed like a strong, good man. I admired him a lot and cherished the time we spent together. He openly favored me because I was, in his words, his only grandkid with any backbone. But he also kept guns everywhere, above his bed, under his bed, and his paranoia only grew worse in his later years. As his dementia set in, he became increasingly violent and convinced people were coming for him. I never understood this side of him until after he died, when my mom finally told me about the murders. I think those events haunted him for the rest of his life. He carried that guilt and paranoia to his grave, leaving behind a complicated legacy. While almost no one mourned his death, I did. He was deeply flawed, but he was also a significant part of my childhood. Story 35. When I was younger, I stumbled upon some love letters addressed to my mother from a man named Pete. They were from her college days at LSU and described their side relationship while Pete was dating someone else. The letters reminisced about my mom attending his basketball games in the early 70s and how he was always worried his main girlfriend would catch them. At the time, it seemed strange, but I didn't dwell on it until I remembered an argument between my parents. My dad had confronted my mom about catching her with a tall guy in a car right before they were married. She insisted it was just an old friend from college and shut the conversation down quickly. As I got older, certain things began to stand out. My mom was 5'9" inches with red hair, and my dad was 6'0" inches with dark hair. There wasn't a blonde-haired gene in sight on either side of my family, nor was there anyone over 6'4". Meanwhile, I'm 6'7", blonde, and better at basketball than anyone in my family. After my mom got sick, I found the letters again. It became clear that the man who wrote them was Pistol Pete Maravich. He talked a lot about his life in basketball. 2 letters were dated after my birth, and their tone shifted. One asked how the situation was, and the final letter expressed regret, saying it was better for everyone if they didn't communicate anymore. Now that both my mom and dad have passed, I've thought about taking a 23andMe or Ancestry DNA test to confirm what I suspect. But so far, I can't bring myself to do it. It feels like opening a door I'm not sure I want to walk through. Story 36. I grew up with an alcoholic and drug addict father. Last year, my mom finally opened up about just how bad things were, and I learned things I never could have imagined. For a few years, we were constantly on the run from my dad. We lived in hotels, moving from one to the next. As a child, I thought it was an adventure, something fun and exciting, but my mom was trying to keep us safe. One day, while my mom was on her way home, she got a call from my dad's best friend. He warned her that my dad was waiting for her in the house and planning to do something bad. Terrified, she called the police and went to a friend's house instead. The next day, the police searched the house. They found all the phone cords cut and the phones thrown outside in the yard. My mom is convinced that my dad had been planning to kill her. Hearing this story so many years later has been incredibly difficult to process. I'm glad I finally know the truth, but it's also left me with so much anger and sadness. I'll never forgive my dad for what he tried to do, and I'll never see him the same way again. Story 37. I don't know if this counts as a dark family secret, so much as the dark truth surrounding my dad's death. Truths I either didn't know or repressed for years. I don't remember much about my childhood. Between repression and my own self-destructive behaviors as a kid, a lot of it is a blur. After my dad died, I was practically raised by my uncle and his wife, who took me in. When I was younger, though, I lived with my mom, her abusive boyfriend, and my sister. My parents were divorced, and I don't have any memories of them together since I was just an infant. As an adult, I found out that their divorce was because my mom cheated on my dad. My sister was the result of her infidelity. Despite this, my dad never treated her any differently. He loved her just as much as he loved me. But my mom made it her mission to punish him for divorcing her. She lied, manipulated, and did everything she could to stop him from seeing us. At one point, my sister and I stayed with my dad for 2 years after some horrifying truths came to light. First, my mom had been lying about me having ADHD and put me on Adderall simply because I was a happy, energetic kid. Worse, her boyfriend had been sexually assaulting my sister. My dad took us in, but shortly after, he hung himself. I didn't understand why at the time. I was only 14. It wasn't until years later that I learned the full story. He had been smoking 4 packs a day, had developed cancer, and couldn't afford both chemotherapy and my therapy. He chose to prioritize me. He never told us any of this, likely to protect us. He was an incredible man, but his death shattered me and pushed me into addiction. After his death, I had to go back to my mom's house, but she kicked me out not long after. My uncle found me living on the streets, got me help, and helped me piece my life back together. I didn't fully grasp how horrific my childhood had been until my uncle and his wife began filling in the blanks for me. I also later learned that my sister had repeatedly begged my mom for help when she was being abused, but my mom didn't believe her. My mom destroyed my dad. She betrayed him in their marriage, the divorce, and the custody battle. She robbed him of peace in life and ultimately pushed him to his death. I can never forgive her for what she did, and I hate her for the life she forced us to endure. Story 38. Here's the story of my grandmother's death. A story I thought I knew, but the truth is much darker. Growing up, I was told that my grandmother died shortly before my first birthday. In her will, she left equal portions of her life savings to each of her grandchildren. When she passed, I inherited $10,000, which was locked in an account until I turned 18. That's the sanitized version. I didn't learn the real story until years later, after reconnecting with my older sister. My grandmother was an alcoholic who lived alone in a duplex with a hot tub in the basement. Around the time I was born, my mom was trying to gain control over the inheritance meant for her kids. Initially, my grandmother had stipulated that the money was only to be used for college tuition, and none of her children, including my mom, were allowed to receive any of it. Shortly after I was born, my mom somehow managed to change the terms of the will, allowing the money to be accessed freely by the grandchildren when they turned 18. This change was made without my grandmother's knowledge. Not long after, my grandmother called my mom and her sister, asking for help moving furniture. When they arrived, no one answered the door. Using a spare key, they let themselves in and found my grandmother drunk and upside down in the hot tub. The police ruled it an accidental drowning. She was intoxicated, fell in, and couldn't get out. However, paramedics noted that she hadn't been dead long by the time the report was made. For her to have drowned, she would have had to be actively drowning as my mom and aunt were at the door, or someone put her in the hot tub intentionally. Given their fraught family history, and the fact that my mom never spoke about her mother during my childhood, it's hard not to wonder. Was her death an accident? Or was there something more sinister at play, possibly tied to the inheritance? I'll never know for sure, but the whole situation is chilling. I'm glad I don't speak to my mother anymore. Story 39. I'm a quarter Dutch, but most of my Dutch relatives live in another state, far from the rest of my Australian family. One day, while hanging out with my cousins and aunt, I asked, "Why do we live here if everyone else is over there?" The answer was surprising. Apparently, the Dutch side of my family is almost like a cult. They follow Catholic apostolism, a belief system where all the men are considered priests. They're extremely selective about who gets to join the family. My side of the family moved away to escape the judgment and control. It started with my oma, my Dutch grandmother, who left with her husband. This led to the birth of my mom and two aunties. Even though my oma left, she never entirely abandoned her religious beliefs and maintained contact with the rest of the family. That's when I learned my oma had a lot more influence in the family than I thought. She wasn't just a housewife, she had power. About 20 years ago, one of my aunties was living in England with her new husband. The Dutch side didn't approve of him, so my aunt and her husband moved to England to get away from the scrutiny. However, my oma bought them a house loan in Australia and sent plane tickets, essentially guilt-tripping them into returning. A year later, my parents received the same deal, a house loan to be paid off over time. Interestingly, neither marriage lasted long. My aunt believed she would still be married if she'd stayed in England. My parents, on the other hand, just weren't a good match, and the weight of the house loan didn't help. Now we're here, an Australian family living 1,000 kilometers away from the rest of the Dutch side. My grandparents and their kids are all fine, but the distance is something we all had to adjust to. At least I got the Germanic height out of it.